Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. First of all, closed captions are enabled, so if you need that facility, please click on the button at the bottom of the screen. Welcome to the last Black, Brown and Green Voices programme for the academic year 2022-23. I'm Dr. Miriam Nightingale, and I'm really honoured to be with you today to share in a conversation with the author of this wonderful new book, Race, Politics and Irish America, A Gothic History by Professor Mary M. Burke. And before I hand over to my friend and colleague, Professor Kim DaCosta, to introduce Mary more formally, I'll just run through a few housekeeping matters. First of all, you'll have noticed that we are recording today's event, and it will be later published on the Glucksman Ireland House NYU YouTube link. You can share it or watch it back. We will make sure to follow up with you so you have the link to it. We plan to run for about 60 or 65 minutes or so. For the first 40 minutes, myself and Mary will chat about the book and her research, and then we will open up for some questions and comments. And just as a gauge, if you would like to start, if you have any questions or comments during our conversation, please don't be shy about putting them there into the all those mechanisms that are there. Also, I'll post a link now shortly. The book is available through the Oxford University Press website with a 30% discount. So I'll share that with you in the chat. I'd also like to thank the teams at Glucksman Ireland House and African American Irish Diaspora Network for their support in mounting this programme of Black, Brown and Green, and indeed all the programmes that we've had over the last few months. Particular thanks also to our promotional partners, NYU's John Brademas Centre and NYPL Schomburg Centre for Research in Black Culture. I will now hand over to Kim DaCosta, who is based at NYU and is also a board member of the African American Irish Diaspora Network, to introduce today's speaker, Mary. Thanks, Kim.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. Mary M. Burke, professor of English at the University of Connecticut, is the author of the Oxford University Press book, Race, Politics and Irish America, A Gothic History. Released in the US in March 2023, it went into a second print run a month later. Burke's first book with OUP was A Cultural History of the Indigenous Irish Traveller Minority. Her collaboration with Tramp Press on a new edition of The Horse of Selene, traveler novelist Juanita Casey's lost classic, launched in the US last month. Burke's work has placed with James Joyce Quarterly, NPR, the Irish Times, RTE, and Faber. She served on Fulbright's Screening Committee for Ireland and is a former NEH Irish Studies Fellow at the University of Notre Dame. A graduate of Trinity College Dublin and Queen's University Belfast, she was a 2022 Long Room Hub Fellow at TCD. The book has been praised in numerous outlets for its addressing of several gaps in the academic literature. In particular, Beth O'Leary-Anish notes that Mary's work fills a gap in Irish literary studies that tend to neglect American authors of Irish descent, fills a gap in American literary studies that often miss the Irishness of the authors they study, like James or Fitzgerald or Frank Yerby, and miss the significance of that in their work, and has been praised for what it's added to Irish American historiography in what I think is such a fascinating aspect of the book, in which Mary sort of decenters JFK and puts in his place Grace Kelly as sort of a pivotal figure in moving Irish Catholics into the mainstream of what is considered white in the US. These are some of the intriguing contributions of Mary's work, about which you're about to hear much more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. Mary, I'm so like Kim, I've so enjoyed hosting this, and congratulations on what an amazing achievement in terms of how you went about this under a relatively short time frame to get it into hands. Let me hand over to you, Mary, because you want to open up maybe with sharing some images.
Sure. Thank you, Kim, very, very much. And Miriam, I don't know how to start thanking you. And again, all the organizations you've listed, there's so many people who sort of behind this series, this wonderful series. And I'm delighted to be the sort of capping it. It's an honor. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share some images. Do share screen. Share. Is everybody seeing the fighting trapper? Yeah, okay, great. So I'm going to simply flick through these wordlessly, and then I'm hoping the talk that I will give will explain some of them, and then if needs be, if people are sort of curious and want to return to them, I'll flick through it again at the very close. It's just maybe a 2-minute slide. Okay, I think I've stopped sharing. All right.
Miriam, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I was on
Okay.
sorry, rookie mistake. Thanks, Mary. And I'll just start off by, we'll come back to some of those images, I think. And I was saying to myself there clearly, I love that image of Grace Kelly, the way she's looking at JFK is so interesting, and we could deconstruct that maybe later. We'll have
I had a friend send an email about that, but I can't repeat. Yes.
Well, let me ask you, what inspired you to embark on this wonderful journey? We're all very grateful, but what was the catalyst for you with this, Mary?
Gosh, there's a number of strands, really. I suppose the first one is I immigrated from Ireland. I immigrated many years prior, really, to Obama's election, started UConn. And at first, my Irish Lit classes, I tended to have mostly white students, many students with Irish surnames. But I think the election of a Black president with white Irish maternal ancestry, this seemed to, I think, cause a shift in the cohort of students who took my classes. I increasingly had students of color in my classes. And I think what's more interesting still is that in the discussions, those students of color would sometimes refer to their own Irish roots. Sometimes it was done in a very tentative tone. I mean, it was complicated for them sometimes, I think, but nonetheless, that was new. I think another strand is another cohort of students. And again, a cohort of students who were kind of ambivalent, but interested. And that was Scots-Irish students. So these are students, Scots-Irish is the term. I'll be getting into this. It's an American term for descendants of Presbyterians who left Ireland from the 18th century onwards. And so when I was teaching early Irish Lit, I would begin with the 3 linguistic traditions. on the island, and that's Ulster Scott dialect poetry, Irish language poetry, and English language poetry. I begin with that. And I would have, similarly kind of complicated responses from students of that ancestry to having their relationship to Ireland described. So all of these things, in America, and I'm going to go backtrack for a moment now to Ireland, but all those things in America, I think, made me very aware that there was much more diversity than the sort of white Catholic immigrant story that I had been sort of given at first. So I was born and educated in Ireland. You can hear that in my voice. So I suppose I brought that lens of sort of an interest in Irish history when I read Irish American writers, the obvious ones like Fitzgerald and O'Neill, but then I started reading the Scots-Irish writers too, Ellen Glasgow, Henry James, and so on. And in all of them, I began to see overlooked concerns with Irish history. But the project was really galvanized by this man here, Frank Yerby. I have loads of these beautiful editions. He was a best-selling African-American author from the 1940s onwards. And he processed his very ambivalent feelings about his maternal Scots-Irish ancestry in a novel called Foxes of Harrow, which you saw on the slide. It's 1946, it's a breakout bestseller. It's centered on it begins by being centered on a southern planter of Dublin, poor Dublin birth. And I see it as a writing back to Gone with the Wind, which is of course another Irish American production, and Margaret Mitchell's novel, very problematic portrayal of enslavement. So for me, Yerby, he exemplifies the diversity of Irish America, really, the diversity in terms of denomination, politics, racial and ethnic identity. And I suppose finally, if I go back further again, to sort of the movements of my life, I think the book is kind of an accumulation in that I've lived on both sides of the Irish border. So I'm dealing with complicated Irish identities from sort of various times and places in Ireland. And I've also lived on both sides of the Atlantic at this stage. And I suppose I think of myself as something of an Irish immigrant. So all of that sort of, I think it just simmered.
And then it was during, if I recollect correctly, Mary, it was during the pandemic that you really kind of, like, as you explain it, these things are years actually of accumulating knowledge and interaction in terms of, and then there's this catalyst in 2020.
I suppose it was the sort of it all came together, I guess, at that time. And I mean, I guess I commute a lot, so I guess it was the sense of having that bit of space and time and isolation. Actually, I needed that isolation to really sit down and process everything that I had read. I'd read all this Irish history, American history, all these Irish American writers. All these sort of studies of race and whiteness and so on. So it finally, yes, it really was the pandemic when it kind of came together,
So one of the things I love about this work that we kind of collectively are doing here in different ways, Mary, is how it in a way forces back on us to think about what we mean by Irishness, because it can be seen in quite kind of one-dimensional ways in the American experience, and you very much unpack those kind of layers of the different strands of what it means, even for those perhaps for whom they wouldn't self-identify necessarily in that way. Can you give us kind of an overview of the book and how you kind of use that as a kind of jumping off point in it? Sure.
Yeah. So I'll give an overview, and then I'll I guess I'll unpack what I mean in the book by Irish American, which is many things. So it's very simply put, it's a history of race and centuries of Irishness in the Americas. And I sort of examine that history through the words and the lives of Black and white writers, particularly, but also many kind of public figures. I look at depictions of the 17th century forcibly transported Irish, so that's one cohort, the 18th century Presbyterian, who became known as the Scots-Irish, and of course, what we think of, I suppose, more often as the Irish in America as the post-famine, post-1845 cohorts. So, it's very much about, I suppose, how those cohorts, their encounters with Native and African Americans over centuries, and the baggage that they bring with them. They bring sectarianism, settler colonial violence that they both experienced and inflicted. It's a complicated story, from this disordered motherland that they're all coming from. And so they become both colluders and victims of oppression in America. So I guess, when I say it's about Irish America, it's not an ethnic pride study, but nor do I suggest that Irish Americans were always on the wrong side of history. It's an ever-changing kind of story. So I suppose what I mean by Irish American is, I think that the usual use of the term for the post-famine Irish alone, that effaces sort of the other centuries of presence in the Americas, from the 17th century, Caribbean, to the frontiers and the plantations. And I think in all of those places, it's often said the Irish whitened once. I think that they racialized first. They were initially racialized and then whitened, I think, multiple times, on all those kind of, in all of those places and times and locations. And I suppose one of the central pivots of the book is that there are, I sort of identify the designations that the white Irish acquired that racialize them. And those are Redlegs, Scots Irish, and Black Irish. And all of these terms really emerged from America's structure of race and the sort of ethnic hierarchy. So I guess by Irish American, I mean Protestant as well as Catholic. I mean Caribbean as well as North American. I mean Black as well as white. I try to cover all of that and account for all of that.
So there's so much I want to talk to you about on that, Mary, but let's kind of stick to our game plan a little bit in terms of what we'll move on to. You cover a diverse range of figures and cultural productions within the book really well. You do such a great job. Talk to me a little bit about that process and what you're doing.
Yeah, I guess I mean, I found it everywhere. So this kind of what's often becomes a kind of a pursuit of unconditional whiteness is very, is of great interest to Irish America. It's critiqued, but it's also condoned at times. Somebody like Mitchell condones it. And I see that in fiction, in drama, in political discourse, in film. I look at guerrilla art, I look at journalism, caricature, statuary, gravestone inscription even makes it in. And of course, that kind of diversity of focus required a really diverse cast. And I go from, the Scots Irish, Andrew Jackson, right up to the family of the Caribbean Irish, Rihanna. I've already mentioned Grace Kelly, with Paul Robeson, John Payne, Maureen O'Hara. In terms of political figures, the Kennedys, Trump, Obama, Frederick Douglass. In terms of writers, I look at Welty, Faulkner, O'Neill, Fitzgerald, Mitchell. And I think what I try to pluck out is not simply a list of all these people and their connections, or sort of their Irish sort of connections to Irishness, but how they're connected to each other, I think creates the story, generates the story. And so I track the connection between Andrew Jackson and the family of Margaret Mitchell, between Grace Kelly and Josephine Baker, and they had a lifelong connection. And Eugene O'Neill was kind of central to Paul Robeson's career, and vice versa too. So I do look at, Presidents Jackson and Kennedy as sort of figures who consolidate, who fix the whiteness of their respective Irish cohorts once they are elected. But I do also attempt to sort of, correct for kind of what has, I think, been an overemphasis on such white public men in the story of sort of Irish whitening, and I try to broaden that to mixed race, obviously to women, to queer writers as well, particularly to Scots Irish figures, and to try and sort of really expand the picture of Irish America. And I think in terms of something like queerness, I look at, I have a phrase, closeted Irishness, to describe Henry James and Grace Kelly's playwright Uncle George Kelly. They're both ambivalent about their sexuality and their ethnic roots. And I try and untangle, well, what's the connection between those two closets, So generally, I suppose Irish American literary criticism ignores Scots Irish, mixed race, non-Irish writers. And so I'm attempting, I think, broadly to, in all of this diversity of sort of, what I look at and who I look at, to correct for the idea that only the straight male Catholic author is the only voice that represents Irish experience in the Americas.
You very much, Mary, and you've touched on it there a little bit. You very much you delve, or you reference a lot the Caribbean, and I suppose that implicitly centers Ireland in terms of the empire and its role in terms of colonizers and people who are colonized. And you linger a little bit on the fact the racialized terms of how the Irish are kind of defined there. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess the southern U.S. was, famously only the northernmost outpost of a plantation system that encompassed the Caribbean. So my vision always was, well, what happens if you go below Virginia? What's going on there? So it was very much that kind of vision of the Americas that I kind of worked with certain of these writers. Thousands of the Irish were forcibly shipped to the Caribbean after Cromwell's conquest. And the term red leg, this emerges from the tendency of the pale white Irish to sunburn. So they were effectively too pale, and that becomes racialized. So in the 17th century in Barbados, Irish redlegs and enslaved Africans actually conspired in uprising together. So it was only as a result of that sort of conspiracy that a differentiation seemed to be made, sort of codified between, white transportee and the enslaved. So that's my starting point. I see it in Faulkner. I see it in O'Neill. They're really interested in that moment.
Yeah, I don't know, Mary, if you myself and Kim had a real treat there about a year and a half ago interviewing Sir Hilary Beckles on his work on Barbados in this period.
Yes.
Fascinating. I mean, the implications in terms of the, race formation, even as exists today, and the Irish part of that is I think has been very much overlooked. It's fabulous to see it.
His work, is fantastic. I mean, I quote one of my favorite lines from him in the book, which is that, you can't always assume that whiteness is always privileged, and he takes the example of sort of the contemporary descendants of the Redlegs as sort of an abject white population in the Caribbean, and he writes beautifully about it. So yeah, he's actually all over. It's all over my book. I adore his work. Yeah.
Talk to me about the Scots-Irish, Mary.
So I guess I should sort of explain exactly what they are. So they were Scottish Presbyterians who took over confiscated native land in 17th century Ulster. And then they themselves began to subsequently depart for colonial America in large numbers throughout the 18th century. By 1790, one half of the 400,000 US residents who were labeled Irish often, these were actually, of this Ulster descent. So they were, and I'm quoting Patrick Griffin a lot right now. So their initial use in Ireland as a bulwark between the English and the native Irish, this was repeated in the New World. And Griffin's phrase is that as occupants of unauthorized tracts on purchase of Native Americans, the Ulster Irish were kind of ambiguously positioned between, European and native, between legitimate and illegitimate, between white and really non-white. And that sort of brought home, I think, in Benjamin Franklin condemns them. Some Scots-Irishmen are involved in a massacre of Native Americans in 1763, and he calls them Christian white savages, which of course implies a kind of flawed whiteness. So in both realms, in both Ireland and in America, the Scots of Irish connections, I mean, they effectively are asked to do the dirty work in some ways of a more entrenched, more powerful colonial class, but, the kind of cultural fantasy of the Injun fighting Scots-Irish frontiersman, the first image that I showed, this kind of inserted them slowly into in American kind of founding myth. And eventually this sort of white Saxon label really of Scots-Irish, this sticks particularly after the sort of poor Catholic influx after the 1845 famine. So you get a hierarchy of this old whitened Irish versus this new post-1845 Irishness that kind of aspires to whiteness. And that I must say that one of the ways in which the history sort of travels is that the inter-ethnic conflict of that motherland erupts not just sort of in Irish American fiction, but also in on the streets of New York and Philadelphia as well.
So that brings us, I suppose, chronologically there a little bit, Mary, you referenced, the to a large extent, the kind of dominant kind of assumption around Irishness became very much kind of linked to the famine Irish, right? And talk to me a little bit about how you integrate that experience into your survey.
Yeah, so I guess it's this really slippery term, Black Irish, right? I had to really contend with that. That one was really tricky. It's a phrase that's used in multiple ways in different times and locations. So what I'm talking about right now then is the post-famine Irish, the marginalized white Irish. They were referred to as Black Irish. Of course, it was also used of Caribbean Blacks of Irish connection. I think that the thing that that sort of gave me a moment of real sort of my aha moment was of course my realization that to call one cohort Black Irish was to suggest that there was an existing white Irish cohort, and I think that is presumably the pre-famine, the Protestant Irish Americans stood there, and of course Black Irish could also be a term to refer to Americans of color who had Irish ancestry or who identified as Irish. And so I'm thinking, again, getting back to Yerby, that scholars of American lit exclude even canonical white writers who are Scots-Irish, like Poe and James and so on. And never mind somebody like Yerby, his identification with his Scots-Irish maternal ancestry was absolutely unassimilable into sort of the idea of who an Irish writer could be, So, the term, in other words, the term Black Irish was not available to Yerby, even though that's the identity he expresses, particularly in some of his late life interviews when he's thinking about a further novel on the San Patricios as it happened. So I think what I often have to grapple with in Q&A related to this book is when I give talks is the how the term is used today. It has been hijacked. The term Black Irish, has been hijacked by contemporary Irish America to describe just a contemporary white Irish coloring. And I always have to sort of say, no, there's no connection to the Spanish Armada. And I think, that hijacking, it effaces Black people with Irish connection in the Caribbean and North America. And it also, I think it effaces the history of the marginalized Irish, famine Irish, who were also sort of given that label too.
Mary, one of the first things I noticed about the book was your subtitle of A Gothic History, and I know by your work that it was very intentional. So tell us a little bit about why Gothic.
I suppose as somebody who sort of moved to the US and started reading Irish American fiction, I got the message that I was supposed to read realistic fiction about the Irish immigrant experience in order to find the truth of Irish America. But I found after a while that was a very partial picture, that non-realism like Gothic, and I'll kind of explain what Gothic is, but it's non-realistic fiction. And I think that it expresses trauma and anxiety extremely well, which makes it a much better conduit in my belief for Irish history, than the Irish history that's been processed by these writers. So Gothic is a genre in which the past, the dead, they refuse to stay dead. The past refuses to stay past. It's also very much a genre about the compromises of obtaining and maintaining power and how they will potentially come home to roost. So the Irish, when they came to America, they often replicated the conditions that had caused their flight from Ireland. So I think writings by and about the Irish in America, that they often conjure up the unfinished history of both Ireland and America. And I sort of had a still there from a production of O'Neill's Desire Under the Elm. It's set in the US in the 19th century, but I think that it simultaneously deals with sort of the two continents. I think it's about the seizure of native lands in America by the earliest Irish cohort, and I think it's about the seizure of native lands in Ireland in the 17th century. But only the first is recognized. So I think scholars ignore Irish history in relation to canonical Irish American authors. Though the authors themselves do not. And I think that's particularly true for non-realistic fiction, where the past is allowed to erupt, the dead come back, And so what I write in the book is that, if the past is a foreign country, then for American writers, that country was often Ireland. And history is Gothic in Irish American narrative because it just won't go away.
So then, Mary, from that, what is Scots-Irish Gothic specifically, which is your own invention, I guess?
Yeah, I had to coin a term because, again, having been sort of trained as a lit scholar in Ireland and being very familiar with Irish Gothic, you know, Dracula, Le Fanu, you know, just showed Le Fanu, Bram Stoker, and so on. We know all the names. And what Irish Gothic tends to be about is it tends to be about the Anglo-Irish ascendancy and its sort of insecurity and its paranoias and anxiety. And many, almost all really, or well, many of the great Gothic writers in Ireland are drawn from that class, or the middling sort of Protestant classes. So it's sort of it's associated with that cohort. But that, I think, calling, you know, that Irish Gothic doesn't account for Ireland's other settler colonial cohort, which is of course the Ulster Scots, you know, the people who become the Scots Irish in America. And they're not plucked out in American Gothic either, even though the very first novel by Charles Brampton Brown called Edgar Huntly, the very first Gothic novel in America, in the American canon, is centered on a very mysterious Scots Irishman. And then of course you have people of Scots Irish descent themselves expressing kind of the unease of the Ulster settler in America in non-realistic fiction. Poe, most famously, Edgar Allan Poe. Also Henry James. I'm really interested in his ghost stories. And William Faulkner, who sort of identifies as Scottish Gaelic rather than Irish, but that sort of brings him to Irishness in his fiction as well. So, you know, this genre of Scots Irish Gothic, it's neither fully Anglo-Irish Gothic nor fully American Gothic. So I had to coin a term to account for that, sort of what I found in sort of American Gothic fiction about the Scots Irish, or by the Scots Irish. So, you know, as I said, Poe and James are both Scots Irish, and Poe stories and the James stories, such as Owen Wingrave in particular, they ruminate hugely on how violence is inherited. And so I'm going to go back to Andrew Jackson for a moment, because he's weirdly central to all of this. So he, you know, as I've said, he secured Scots Irish whiteness as the first of many presidents of that ancestry. He was the son of Ulster settler colonists. He was an enslaver. He was the scourge of Native Americans. And so for Fitzgerald and James, both of these Irish American writers, Jackson's treatment of American of color seems to echo the role the ancestors of the Scots Irish played in 17th century Ulster in taking over confiscated land, because both Fitzgerald and James depict Jackson in their fiction as this kind of spectral, malevolent presence. So, you know, I think, you know, again, to get back to why Gothic. So Irish history, I think, is so disordered that it exceeds the bounds of realism, if you want to sort of portray it. So overall, I think Gothic really suits the expression of, you know, unfinished history and inherited violence, and how the dead just come back.
Yeah, it's lovely to have an opportunity to talk to you about it. It works so well in the book, Mary. So it's great. Notions of inheritance and naming and male lines in terms of how land and things are passed on, that's kind of central to your survey. Tell us about those themes.
Yeah, that's why I flicked up the Henry James and Henry James. It's like they've the same name, the father and son, you know. And so I think the settlement of Ireland by many with British surnames, I think this made the Irish culture exquisitely, like almost, well, too attuned really to the associations of surnames. So surnames in the Irish context, and I think Anna Burns' recent novel, really, Milkman, does great things with this. Surnames in the Irish context is often taken as, you know, evidence of loyalties, of denomination, of ethnicity. So in other words, the allegiances and the sins of the father are inherited along with the surname, you know, and surnames really haunt in Scots Irish Gothic. So both, I think it's so really, really striking that both Poe and James have a ghost story in which the dead male ancestor returns to haunt his descendant who has the exact same name. So surnames down the male line, I sort of look at that as well in terms of sort of how I coined a phrase, ancestor haunted, that the Irish male body can be ancestor haunted. And my central figure for that was John Mitchell. So he was the pro-slavery Irish nationalist who fled to America after he escaped jail, very much a hero of Irish nationalist America. He had a grandson in World War I era New York who had the exact same name. He was also John Mitchell. And Mayor Mitchell was very, very much at odds, however, with the politics of his grandfather and with the politics of Tammany Hall, actually. But his ancestor, John Mitchell, the grandfather, his ancestor's reputation amongst New York Irish nationalists bedeviled the mayor's public life and makes it into courtroom scenes and so on that I sort of detail in the book.
Yeah, and it the whole idea of naming Mary in terms of the interconnectedness of the Black and Irish experience in terms of
yes,
how names are used, and I'll never forget the first time I found the name of an enslaved person with the name of a place in Ireland. He had been given that name, and like a naming way that we might celebrate in another context. It was very arresting to realize that what happened with names and how that worked.
Yeah, I think a lot of the readings I do of particular text hinges on surnames, but also place names. You're right. So Eric Walrond was an Afro-Caribbean Gothic writer. And I delved into his text because the estate, the planter's estate in his short stories in the Caribbean island was called Waterford. So I thought there's something going on here. I need to read Eric Walrond. So yeah, it's everywhere. And I think that writers are very alert to surnames and place names. And so we should always pay attention to the names they choose,
Two very Irish surnames, O'Neill and Fitzgerald, iconic names in terms of the American canon. I love this, and I love how you tease this out in the book, Mary, how they depict their Irishness and race. They're kind of different. Can you share that with our audience?
Yeah, so they're similar on the surface. They're near contemporaries. They're both raised in comfortable Catholic Irish American homes, but they do differ in fundamental ways in this way, as you said. So Fitzgerald really over-identified with the one non-Irish branch of his family that exemplified what for him was kind of Saxon whiteness. And this emphasis has been unquestioned by critics. And I actually ended up discovering that he had modest 18th century Irish American roots. And that this effaced Irishness, this kind of unspoken ancestry is everywhere in his work, and it fuels this huge unease regarding the Irish class, the Irish racial status that I see everywhere in his fiction. I think O'Neill's quite different in many ways. That's not to say that Fitzgerald is always unsympathetic, but it's complicated for him. Whereas for O'Neill, he's the son of a famine refugee. He's very conscious of Irish history. He's very conscious of the weight of that history as it comes across the Atlantic with his father. This drama very much critiques, I think, Irish presence in the America over centuries. He really goes back to the Caribbean. And he critiques it as one long failure of solidarity with peoples of color in many ways, if you look at his work as a whole. Unfinished history returns to haunt, the supposedly American action of O'Neill's dramas many times. I have found in his work plantation, famine, even partition in Desire and Beyond, I think. He also, I think, he very much was at the forefront of placing African-American protagonists and actors on the Broadway stage in a period in which white dramatists did not bother to do that. I showed a still from his play about an interracial marriage between an Irish-American woman and a Black man, and that was Paul Robeson's breakout role. There was a hand kiss scene in that play, and O'Neill received threats from the Ku Klux Klan as a result. So in other words, O'Neill really put himself out there, in a way that Fitzgerald is interested in race and is uneven in his depiction. But I think that there's a certainty of belief in equality in O'Neill that just shines through,
Tell me a little bit, Mary, if you would mind, about your chapter, How the Irish Became Red, which is a great chapter title, by the way. Yes,
it's a riff on, I suppose, how the Irish became white, for anyone not familiar with that, canonical book on race and Irishness. So I guess I'm thinking about how there's a kind of a defective Irishness in both O'Neill and Fitzgerald, but, sort of, again, done in different ways, approached in different ways. So O'Neill's has an early sea play set in the Caribbean. He stages very charged encounters between white Irish sailors and Black women. So he's very tuned to, he himself had sailed the seas, actually. He's very tuned to the deep history of the Caribbean as a site of Black and red joint rebellion, So just to sort of jump to the 20th century and Fitzgerald more specifically. So there's something called a Fitzpatrick scale in dermatology. created by an Irish-American dermatologist. And on that scale, Irish skin is so white as to effectively be flawed. It's subject to all kinds of conditions and so on. It's too pale. So to burn, if we go back to the 17th century Caribbean, to burn there was a racial liability, but to burn was also a social liability on fashionable 1920s Riviera beaches, on which, you know, an even tan suddenly began to signal, you know, sort of elite whiteness. So that strange trend, that strange about face for tanning amongst the elite whites was actually popularized by Fitzgerald Riviera Circle, if we're looking at the Anglophone world. So you know, bearing that in mind, I tried to sort of unpack that fact versus the contradiction that he denigrates himself, Fitzgerald denigrates himself in a letter to another Irish-American author as half Black Irish. So there's a real strange, contradictory, complex vocabulary of race in Fitzgerald's fiction around skin tone, around tanning, around sunburns, around being half Black. So one of my subtitles is tan lines, you know, in reference to kind of his claim to be half Black Irish as a denigration.
With the book, Mary, you know, the term plantation, Ireland and in the United States, they're like, in my mind, it was when I was reading the book, it was like, they're so disjointed in terms of where my mind goes when I think of the words. They're very specific, right? And you bring them together to us really, together for us really nicely in, I believe, chapter 4 of the book. Unpack that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so yeah, I do think about Eudora Welty and Elizabeth Bowen in terms of, as you said, sort of pulling together the Irish big house and the Southern plantation. But most of the time in that chapter, I do look at what I call 3 Irish planter novels. They're Southern planters of Irish connection to various degrees. I've got Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. I've got William Faulkner's Absalom. They're both 1936. And Yerby's Foxes of Harrow from 46. So in all 3 novels, you have 3 initially penniless, initially off-white planters. They have all fled an exploitative landowner class. But they gain their freedom from that subjugation by, of course, subjugating Black or native bodies themselves. So obviously, you know, from a literature point of view, that they're very different novels. Faulkner writes this complicated Gothic modernism. He does this complication and so both mourns and condemns the Old South. Yerby and Mitchell then write this much more accessible historical fiction, but of course they portray slavery in completely opposed ways. And all 3, as I've said already, are kind of authors of Irish connection. For Faulkner's complicated connection to Ireland, I actually coined the term Galo-American, because I found in Fitzgerald and in Faulkner that there is an implied kind of Highland Scottish and Irish affiliation that plays out in their work, for which I could not find a term at all, you know.
One of the great services you've done for us in this is to bring Frank Yerby's bio and his work into our orbit. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Yerby, he's made a critical comeback actually in recent years, and I'm very grateful to, there's a whole bunch of scholars that I name check in the book who've sort of been part of that. He was a best-selling author back in the day. He was reckoned by Time magazine to be the highest earning author in America in about 1954. The novel Ideal with Foxes of Harrow was his breakout bestseller. It centers on Stephen Fox, who's a poor immigrant from Dublin. He rises in Louisiana society by acquiring a plantation. Then he names Harrow. I'm going to get back to the significance of that name. So I think Yerby's own dual heritages, you know, Black and Irish, it really marks Foxes of Harrow, because Fox has what's called gutter snipe Dublin origins. He's lived on the streets. And so this very much challenges the South sort of Black-white binary, as do all the mixed race characters and the intermarriage between Black and white characters as well in the novel. So there was a 1947 film adaptation starring Marion O'Hara, which I sort of threw on the screen at the start, but that excised the novel's more seditious Black characters, and it also excised Frederick Douglass, who had made a cameo in the novel. So Yerby was extraordinary. He sold well in the South, but they were very careful not to kind of name his racial identity in publicity in the South. So he walked a very difficult sort of, he did a very difficult balancing act, but I think slipping Frederick Douglass in as a cameo tells us everything we want to know about how secretly seditious CRB was as a writer in the period.
On the surface with Yerby, he and Mitchell have a lot in common.
Yeah. On the surface, I guess. Yeah. So they're both raised in segregated Georgia. They're both raised by mothers of Irish descent, but of course their socially assigned racial identities completely, lead to these very divergent representations of the antebellum South. So, Gone with the Wind, Georgia plantation of the Irishman Gerald O'Hara. Du Bois, famously condemning the Southern White Fairy Tale right before it was published, but that's what it is. It's a Southern White Fairy Tale. People are happily enslaved in this novel. Yerby's novel is by contrast, he's got these really rebellious, articulate of African-American characters, and they take over the narrative as well in the post-Civil War period. So the Planters family sort of begin to share the stage basically with the sort of the Black characters who intermarry with them as the action goes on. And both Faulkner as well and Yerby, their Irish planters end up having heirs who are, illegitimate, as the term used to be, illegitimate mixed race young men. Whereas by contrast, in that kind of Irish and African hybridity and interraciality is absolutely impossible in the sealed white supremacist universe of Mitchell's imagining in Gone with the Wind. So they end up being quite different.
Mary, we're slower going through what we did a lot of questions that we had hoped to get through. I'm wondering if, and Kim has a question, and I want to open up the audience. Could I skip maybe? Could we skip to looking at the idea of the fairy tale, the Kennedy Gothic, and bringing Kelly a little bit? Is that okay?
That's fine. I just want to say, I think it's important. I just wanted to note that I want sort of, just in case there's an impression that it's always sort of Jackson and the Scots-Irish who are the villains, that I read sort of a Catholic Irish nationalist villainy through Mitchell's own family as well. That the planter in her novel, he has got his lands because they've been stripped. The lands have been taken from Native Americans by General Andrew Jackson. That was actually true of Mitchell's own family. So I very much read that kind of the collusion of all stripes of Irish America in oppression through Mitchell's own ancestors, and that this plays out in her novel. But yes, I'm happy to jump to. I did want to get that in, but I'm happy to jump to.
No. I'm glad you did, Mary. That's important to note.
Yeah.
So I guess to kind of talk to us a little bit about and Kim referenced it there, how you kind of introduce Grace Kelly as in this kind of arc of the ascension on some level of the Irish, and how it's reverberating from the recent coronation from Queen Elizabeth. We're all coronationed out recently, but talk a little bit about how you weave this into this so well.
Yeah, so I guess I wanted to think about what was the opposite of Gothic, in literature, and that is the fairy tale. And princess is always central to the fairy tale. So Grace Kelly is my attempt to kind of expand, sort of who gets considered in kind of surveys of Irish America. So she has a royal wedding in 1956. She marries the Prince of Monaco. And this is kind of, the fairy tale of full assimilation achieved, the woman of famine Irish roots, rises to royalty. And I argue in the book that this paves the way for the rise of the family who are not, coincidentally called America's royals, and that is the Kennedys. So we have to remember, I think we forget how much Catholicism was stigmatized as a religion of the not quite white immigrant in America. And so Kelly's wedding was explicitly Catholic. It's a Catholic ceremony. It's broadcast worldwide. It's one of the largest media events of the decade. I'll get back to another large event in a moment. And it was broadcast live by MGM. It was watched by about 13 million people. And that other huge television event only 3 years previously was the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. And so I argue that given the proximity of these two massive events, that for Irish nationalists, Ireland and Irish nationalist America, that Grace's wedding was kind of a riposte to, an answer to the crowning of the British monarch. And I think that this globally visible ascent, this globally visible change of status, that it altered the social and racial status of Irish America. But then I suppose, again, it pivots back to Gothic again, because I think that the dream of assimilation, that sort of a very problematic dream in many ways, that it becomes a Gothic nightmare, you know, in the sort of after the Kennedy assassinations in many ways, you know.
Yeah, no, and you're right. It's something that we have to be careful to kind of pay attention to, that strand of Catholicism as it evolves. And I guess we're getting really short on time, but
Sure.
The Kennedy, I mean, is there more that you'd like to say there? In terms,
yes, I think I'd like
so hard to distill down.
So I'll try and say this quickly, all I say about the Kennedy. So in Gothic literary tradition, you know, the princess in the castle was always sort of nightmare around the corner. And that vocabulary of nightmare, of Gothic, was used in cultural and journalistic portrayals of the Kennedys. Gothic, you know, in the still I showed really quickly, it centers on power and its abuse. And it fits competing theories, these competing conspiracy theories around the Kennedys, both innocent victims or as wicked schemers. So Gothic always involves conspiracy, corruption, Catholicism in its 18th century beginnings, sexual excess, beautiful endangered women, disrupted inheritance. And so the Kennedys fit this ready-made cultural mold of Gothic, and it fits for both conservatives and liberals. So liberals and Democrats who approved of the progressive politics of that administration, they saw the idealistic Kennedys as innocent victims of dark conspiracy. On the other hand, conservatives and then Catholic Irish Americans who were leaving sort of hereditary Democratic Party loyalty behind, they saw America's royals as sort of the epitome of the immorality of the aristocratic elite, you know. So in Kennedy Gothic, you know, the role of the corrupt elder was assigned to John Kennedy Jr., or John Kennedy Sr. rather, the president's father. The role of the endangered beautiful woman, I think, was given to Jackie after, you know, she's seen crawling in this bloody suit. And, you know, despite Bobby Kennedy's kind of idealism, his support for civil rights, I think this notion of a morally complex Kennedy, particularly males, I think, emerges in the years after the assassinations. And Ted Kennedy himself sort of plays a role in it. Obviously, he's involved in the 1969 death of a young woman in his company. He refers to, in a press conference about that incident, he refers to, quote, some awful curse, you know, that sort of has played some kind of role in this, according to him. And so, of course, this very Gothic idea of a family curse takes off in popular lore, and it's been used ever since to kind of explain the numerous premature deaths of the Kennedys in the years since. So I think I'm really struck by the fact that family history as curse, this idea, it really is, it sort of fits in with this wider Irish American narrative as the past, as Gothic, as the past, you know, as something that comes back. These unresolved sins, these unresolved traumas, they demand later acknowledgement, later retribution. The past is never past. So yeah, I'm hoping that.
No, that's great, but and you do such a great job in the book, and there's the Kennedys are so fascinating. Bobby in particular, as you allude to there. Kim, can I bring you in there with your question before and if that's okay with you,
Sure.
Mary?
Yeah, it keeps kind of morphing as we talk. So Mary, I've been so fascinated with the ways that you have so deftly brought multiple Irishnesses to the fore and thought about them in relationship to each other. My question is more about what the stakes of this project are and what the implications of them are. And I think, you know, this comes up for me when thinking about Frank Yerby, but also thinking about what the African American Irish Diaspora Network is up to the extent that, you know, we keep hearing more and more about people, in particular African Americans, discovering, recovering, often by way of a DNA test, their Irish ancestry. And yet what you're describing is multiple Irishnesses that that can be sort of flattened with the language of this broad Irishness. And so, you know, when I think about Frank Yerby, he's of Scots-Irish descent. His mother is, I presume, mixed race. Even as he's, you know, recovering that for himself, it's an important part of, as he gets older, part of who he understands himself to be. I guess, you know, what do we gain from this sort of broadening and expanding the notion of Irishness, and what do we potentially lose with that
That's interesting.
very broad characterization?
Yeah. So I guess what we gain, what I gained by paying attention to the fact that he's of Scots-Irish ancestry was it helped me read his novel more carefully, because what he does, and nobody else does it, Faulkner doesn't do it for all his subtleties, is he also pays attention to, and he does this before this is theorized, to how the poor whites in the hills were also disenfranchised by enslavement, because of course there's no need for paid labor when you can have enslaved labor. So he was alert to a very sort of 360-degree vision of how narrow a population it was who benefited from enslavement. So he saw how it affected poor whites as well. And I think that was because he had a notion of himself as being also Scots-Irish, and also being aware that the Scots-Irish, certainly Scots-Irish were, you know, there was an elite Scots-Irish, just as there's an elite Catholic Irish cohort as well. But I'm sort of more interested, and so was he, was in the kind of the more the abject, poor white, you know, what we call poor white is, you know, often effectively in the areas associated with Scots-Irish settlement. So I think that's what I gained in sort of parsing out, not just saying Frank Yerby is Irish, but being really specific and saying Frank Yerby saw himself as Scots-Irish and was kind of aware of that. And you can see that alertness to what that means when he depicts poor whites, or refers to poor whites in Foxes of Power. What do we lose? Oh, that's a really interesting question. I suppose we might lose. I'm always alert to, and I mentioned this in the book, when somebody in the Americas, plural, has an Irish surname, there are multiple ways by which they could have acquired that surname, you know, and we need to be alert to those multiplicities, and to be sensitive to them. And so I wrote a little bit as well about how in a place like Montserrat, there was an entrenched Irish planter class, you know. So you know, somebody could, you know, there is a way by which, Marcus, Garvey, you know, famously, that's how he came by his Irish ancestry. So there is, and that's one of the complexities I get into as well with, you know, there's a line from a poet that I quote, contemporary African-American poet, who speaks of her mixed race background and says, "I have rape-colored skin." So I think that's what we don't want to, and I was careful to point out, I think that my students had my African-American students had a tentative response to sort of, they were tentative when they talked about their Irish ancestry, because I think they're very, very aware that there are multiple ways by which they might have come by that ancestry. So I think that's something we could potentially lose, is that sort of multifaceted vision of sort of the interactions of the Irish and people of African descent in the Americans in various places, times and places over centuries.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Mary, but sometimes when I'm thinking of that question Kim has asked as well, that what we're not trying to do is claim that their accomplishments are because of the Irishness and taking away
right.
Then
yes.
From, you know, that kind of way, Kim, that's very easy for it to kind of fall into that kind of a scenario, which I think most good humans are trying not to do, but you can be taking away agency. Kim, unless you have a follow-up question there, I just want to pick up. I'm going to try and I'm sorry, Mary, that we haven't gotten through as many of the questions we had outlined.
Got through a lot,
But Shane has a question here. You refer to the famine Irish aspiring to whiteness. what do you make of more recent criticisms of whiteness scholarship in North American immigration history, that it conflates race with color, that it over-relies on the analytical category of whiteness to account for nativism motivated more by anti-Catholicism, class and ethnic hatreds, and that it feeds popular myths about false equivalencies between Black and Irish experiences? That's a big question, but
that's huge, yeah. And
yeah,
I really don't look at, I was trying to do so much with multiple Irishnesses that I really didn't bother. I mean, I refer very briefly to Italian Americans, because that's analogous in certain ways, but I really didn't delve into, you know, sort of Jewish or sort of other white or identities that become white, I suppose. So I can't really comment on that, but yeah, I mean, this is a fraught, you know, field. It really is, and it's very dangerous. And I think one of the great dangers I found was to really go back to the absolute dangerous ground is what I called viral online pseudo history in terms of what was called white slavery. That's really dangerous. And that is, it's everywhere online. This notion that because the Irish were abject in the Caribbean, that somehow makes them, you know, their experience there of temporary sort of you know, bondage, that is somehow equivalent to an eternal bondage, which was what, you know, was sort of given to sort of transportees out of Africa. So that's very, very dangerous. And I think, yeah, there's political uses being made of, you know, these long ago kind of interactions and connections between Irish and Blacks in the Caribbean. And I was extremely careful to sort of begin my survey of that by sort of discounting what I call that viral pseudo history. I mean, I've dealt with pseudo history in the past, but now it's gone viral. So it's actually, you know,
it's on anyone's cell phone.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, Mary? Ted Smith there earlier asked, would you go through the images again? I think you're right.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Ted. Yes, because I intended to do that. Yes.
I think that's it's in light of now everything we've heard.
Sure.
It's really great to see them
Yeah.
again, because they're really evocative.
Okay, let me just pull it up because I got rid of the document so that I wouldn't. So I need to do a screen share. Let me go back in here. Ted, you're really testing the limits of my technology here. Share screen. So I might maybe just talk them through this time. So I guess how much time do we have, Miriam? So that
we're actually like 2 minutes from being finished.
Oh, 2 minutes. Okay, so I'll just flick through them again. That was a Columbus Day piece of graffiti, which is an important detail there. I think it's very ominous in the blood red paint. This is Annie Ryan's production in Dublin. That's Paul Robeson's breakout role. This woman is very interesting, Belfast parents, immigrant parents. So I really like that casting. This is, I said, the sort of charged moment of sort of Irish and African contact in the Caribbean. This is Frank Irby. I didn't really get into Obama, but that woman made Irish American magazine. This is Rihanna's grandaunt who's sort of referred to as redlegging. And this is the film depiction of Mitchell's planter. This is the coronation alongside 3 years later, Grace's, and this is a lunch that Grace had with John F. Kennedy right before she makes her official visit to Ireland. And I put Kennedy in brackets there because this is Gothic, but really it's also, I think, how the Kennedys are discussed so much. I was very struck by this. This is the official portrait. She really does this look, this elongated in the portrait. And this is really recalls the Gothic kind of novel imagery. This is a 2018 Dr. King March. And I was looking for this vintage piece everywhere online. And I couldn't reproduce it. We couldn't find the artist. So what I did was I reproduced somebody carrying it instead. It was a hugely popular tapestry in the 60s. And I'm really intrigued by it. It's the two Kennedy brothers flanking Dr. King. So it really speaks to, I think, that kind of Democrat tradition in many ways, you know.
Mary, we're just on time here, unfortunately, and there are some other comments there, and I see someone has a raised hand. and I don't know whether you can put what you have to say into the chat really quickly. I see Catherine Shannon just said she just finished reading a biography of Ted Kennedy, and Gebler suggests that Ted was haunted by a kind of Gothic outlook regarding the fate his family faced, and yet he had sympathy with the downtrodden, as is so evident by the legislation he championed. Ted Smith also asked earlier about the issue of the kind of quantifying how many people of African American ancestry have Irish ancestry, and I don't know about you, Mary, but I've never been able to find of any. Yeah.
No, I actually don't know what the figures are at all. No.
Yeah, it's not well documented, and it's something I'll be looking into.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll wait for that, Kim. That would be great.
I wish we had more time, but I encourage you, because Mary does as good a job as she just did in terms of sharing it with us verbally. This is a really important intervention into the literature and a great read. As you can see, in terms of the personalities, the cultural figures, the themes that are touched on by virtue of you being here today. This is going to be something you're really going to enjoy reading. I'll follow up with the link to the Oxford University Press website so you can avail of the discount. Mary, thank you for coming on to talk to us today and to share this with our viewers of this of Black, Brown and Green Voices. As I mentioned, this is our last event for this academic year, and it's such a wonderful way for us to finish out. And I congratulate you on bringing this forth to us, and I'm really delighted to see the reviews that are beginning to come in for it, because there are going to be lots more, and they're so well deserved, and I know they're going to be really laudatory about it. We're taking a break now for the spring, and I'm delighted to say that we will be back in the fall. We already have the lineup for fall pretty much locked down. 3 years ago, we pivoted to this online public programming dimension of this program, and it's so wonderful to be able to share examples of work and scholarship and experiences through this forum. We'll follow up with the link to the event if you'd like to watch it back or to share it with others. Thank you, Kim, for coming on to do the introduction. And most importantly, thank you, Mary, and congratulations on Race, Politics and Irish America. You explained very well why it's a Gothic history, and it's really, really well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kim. Thank you all for coming out too on Friday. I appreciate it.
Okay. That's great. Can I get a quick photo of us, the three of us smiling?
Oh, that would be lovely. Yeah, thank you. Because I never remember to take photos.
I'm just going to do that real quick.
Are we? It's just three of us at this stage.
No, there are lots of people listening, so don't say anything.
I'm never sure how these things end. You know? I should have a look at the questions in case I can get back to them.
Oh yeah, I won't hang up till you take a look at them, Mary. So just look at your camera real quick, and I'll just take a quick photo for the record.
Oh God, sound was choppy, was it?
Myself and Kim didn't think so.
Right.
Maybe
hopefully a little. That was that other person's own.
Yeah.
Oh, somebody said that was way too short. Well, that's a lovely thing to say. Yeah. That's the best thing anybody could have
said. Let me take a really quick photo there before.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, look at some more came in there after. Oh no, that was Scott Spencer. No question. Just thank you for a fascinating talk. Congratulations. Martine was on, great session. Oh, Angela. Okay, great. That's wonderful. Yeah, no, Mary, I'm sorry that we didn't get through everything.
Kim, was it coherent? Because Miriam and I knew what else we wanted to say, but did it remain coherent?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh no,
okay.
Yeah.
I think once I just covered Margaret Mitchell's ancestry, that kind of balanced it out, you know. Because I'm very conscious as well that history of tensions between Scots Irish and Catholic Irish. I don't want to be sort of saying, oh, the Scots Irish are villains, you know, and all of this. You know?
Yeah.
So I really wanted to get that in. No.
Yeah. No, that was great that you did that. No, I think that worked really well. So I guess there's, are there more things coming in? Oh yeah, there's some more.
There is, yeah, hold on.
Oh
I
great,
think,
that's
are there
nice.
still 10 people on? Hold on.
There are actually 40 people on, so people are not in a rush to go anywhere, which is a good
Oh,
sign.
okay.
Yeah,
Well,
no,
for anyone who's on, if you want to drop me a line, if there was something pressing that didn't get addressed, you know.
yeah, there's so much in it, Mary. Isn't, you know, you cover a lot of ground, and yeah, I wish we'd had another hour, but that's okay. We got
That's grand. That's grand.
Yeah, no, I think you did a really great job, because it is a lot to kind of bring together. So
I do find it actually hard to keep to my head. That's terrible to say about my own book, but I do.
no, but there's so much there. No,
Yeah.
you know.
Even again, when you said earlier Anne Lowe, I was like, oh yeah, Anne Lowe, you know, because she's only got a tiny paragraph, but she's kind of pivots, you know, she allows me to pivot, you know, she's very kind of, she's weirdly central too for that reason.
Say again, Kim.
Ava raised her hand. I don't know.
I missed that.
Oh,
I don't know if
someone.
we can still connect.
Oh yeah, no, I know. Hold on now. Wait, let's see if I can. I should know how this function works.
Delighted that Catherine Shannon was on. She's wonderful. She's just stalwart.
Yeah, here it's Zelly. I think she's a scholar in the field. Hold on now.
Oh gosh, she's a scholar of race and
Yes.
nursing. Yeah, I saw
Yeah,
her.
I know her, and I'm
Yes.
probably mispronouncing. Let's see if I can unmute her. Allowed to
Yeah,
talk.
she's still here. Yeah, I love her
Hello.
work.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi everyone. Sorry.
Hi, nice to chat
accidentally
with you. I know your work very well.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. I was trying to just say thank you in the chat, and I raised my hand by accident. But yeah, it's a
That's okay.
fascinating session.
We're forcing you to talk now. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Thanks everyone. Bye. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Or afternoon.
Yeah, my sister's on.
Oh, great. Yeah, it was nice to see so many familiar names there. Well, listen, thank you both of you for doing it. And
Thank you.
my colleague at Glucksman Ireland House will post it online, and we'll send that out through all the people and share it with you. And hopefully we'll meet in person before too long, Mary.
I know. No, we need to do that. Yeah, that needs to happen. We'll, we're getting down to the Kerry area, so we might just make it over to Cork, sometime.
Oh yeah,
sometime.
It's not a million miles away. And Kim is coming over to teach a class in Trinity over the summer, so we have.
What are you teaching now? Where are you teaching? What program, Kim? What are you?
Well, it's through NYU. It's called the Black and Green Atlantic. So
nice.
I will be assigning some of this.
Yeah. Oh, that's
thank you.
Great.
So that's Peter O'Neill's book title. I presume Peter has been involved.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Oh, this is perfect for the students in that class, Kim, isn't it? That's great.
Very good.
Yeah. Well done, Mary.
Yeah, no, it's I like, you can tell I'm really interested in Hollywood performers and stage performers and stuff. So I have students really respond to that. They love hearing about Josephine Baker and Grace Kelly and so on. So.
I can imagine. Listen, thanks to you both, and great to see you.
Thank you.
And we'll be in touch, okay?
Okay, have a good relaxing weekend, both of you.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
bye.